Julian Vance had bought 37 properties in his lifetime, and he had never once walked through the front door of any of them before signing. Real estate was numbers. Acreage, waterfront footage, zoning clearances, tax margins. He didn't need to smell the ocean air or admire the view. He needed the deep water dock attached to 50 acres of coastal Maine wilderness, and he needed it before his competitors figured out why. The deal closed on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, Julian was standing at the iron gate of the Hargrove estate, coffee in one hand, his phone buzzing with 17 unread messages in the other. He ignored every single one. The property stretched out before him like something ripped from an old painting. Rolling green lawns sloped down toward a gray Atlantic shoreline, and somewhere past the tree line, the dock waited. That dock could handle vessels up to 400 feet. Commercial grade, hidden from the main coastal traffic lanes by a natural rock formation. For a man who moved cargo across 6 continents, this was better than gold. His driver, Marcus, stayed with the car at the gate. Julian preferred to walk properties alone the first time. It was the only sentimental habit he allowed himself. He followed the gravel path past the main house, a sprawling colonial structure with cedar shingles weathered silver by decades of salt wind. The windows were dark. Good. The previous owner, old Frederick Hargrove, had died 8 months ago, with no direct heirs. The estate lawyers had been eager to sell, almost too eager, Julian had thought at the time. But the price was right, and the dock was perfect, so he signed without asking too many questions. That was his first mistake. The gravel path curved left past the main house and opened into a wide courtyard. And there, catching the full morning sun, stood something Julian had completely overlooked in the property photographs. A glass house. It was enormous, easily 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a Victorian iron frame holding hundreds of glass panels, some of them frosted with age, others still perfectly clear. Through those clear panels, Julian could see a jungle of green, plants everywhere, hanging from the ceiling, climbing the walls, filling long wooden tables in neat rows. This wasn't some abandoned greenhouse left to rot. Someone was taking care of it. Someone was working in it, right now. Julian stopped walking. Through the glass, he watched a woman move between the tables. She wore a plain canvas apron over a gray sweater, her brown hair pulled back in a messy knot. She was holding a small instrument against the soil of a potted plant, reading numbers off a handheld device and writing them down in a thick notebook. She hadn't noticed him yet. Julian pushed open the glasshouse door. The air inside hit him immediately. Warm, humid, rich with the smell of wet earth, and something faintly sweet, like jasmine. The woman looked up from her notebook. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop anything. She just looked at him, the way someone looks at a delivery person who showed up on the wrong day. "Can I help you?" she asked. Julian was not used to being spoken to casually. He ran Vance Global Logistics, a shipping and distribution empire that handled $2 billion in cargo annually. People prepared for meetings with him weeks in advance. They rehearsed what they were going to say. This woman was looking at him like he had interrupted her lunch break. "I own this property," Julian said. "As of 48 hours ago." She tilted her head slightly. "You're Julian Vance. You know who I am. Your name was on the transfer documents. I received a copy from the estate lawyers last week." She set down her instrument and wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm Chloe Mercer." The name meant nothing to him. "Ms. Mercer, I'm going to be direct. I purchased this estate in its entirety. The house, the grounds, the waterfront, and every structure on it. That includes this glass house. I'll need you to arrange to move your things within the week." Chloe looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to a filing cabinet wedged between two tables, overflowing with ferns. She pulled open the top drawer, thumbed through a set of folders, and removed a single document sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. She handed it to Julian. He took it. The document was a research contract dated 11 years ago, signed by Frederick Hargrove himself. Julian read it once, quickly. Then he read it again, slowly. The contract granted Chloe Mercer exclusive, irrevocable access to the Glasshouse Conservatory and its surrounding quarter-acre of grounds for the purpose of long-term botanical research. The term was 25 years. It was attached as a binding rider to the property deed, meaning it transferred automatically to any new owner. Julian's own lawyers had either missed it or buried it in the fine print he never read. His jaw tightened. 14 years remain on that contract, Chloe said. She wasn't smug about it. She said it the way a pharmacist reads the dosage on a prescription, just facts. I've been conducting soil amendment and plant pathology research here since Dr. Hargrove invited me to use the facility. The work is grant-funded through the University of Southern Maine. I'm not squatting, Mr. Vance. I'm under contract. Julian looked up from the document. He had dealt with hostile negotiations on 4 continents. He had stared down union leaders, port authority officials, and rival executives who would have happily watched his company burn. A botanist in a canvas apron was not going to rattle him. But the contract was airtight. He could see that without calling his lawyers. Old Hargrove had used serious legal language, and the rider clause was ironclad. I wasn't informed about this, Julian said, keeping his voice level. Your acquisition team should have flagged it during due diligence, Chloe replied. The rider is recorded with the county clerk's office. It's public record. She was right, and that irritated him more than anything else. Julian folded the document and handed it back to her. Fine, you have your contract. But understand something. I'm developing this property for commercial use. There will be construction, equipment, personnel. This glass house sits directly in the path of my planned access road to the dock. Chloe took the document and slid it back into the filing cabinet. Then I suggest you reroute your access road, Mr. Vance, because this glass house and I are going to be here for the next 14 years. She picked up her instrument, turned back to her plants, and resumed testing the soil as if he had already left. Julian stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked out of the glass house, back into the cool Maine morning. He pulled out his phone and called his chief of staff. Get me the full background on a woman named Chloe Mercer, he said, botanist, connected to the University of Southern Maine, and find out which lawyer handled our due diligence on the Hargrove acquisition. I want them in my office by tomorrow morning. He hung up and looked back at the glass house. Through the glass, Chloe was already bent over her notebook again, completely untroubled by the fact that one of the most powerful men in international shipping had just threatened to bulldoze her workspace. Julian walked toward the dock. He had a lot of thinking to do. And for the first time in a very long time, a property acquisition had given him something he didn't expect. A problem he couldn't just buy his way out of. By 6 o'clock that evening, Julian had walked the entire property twice, mapped the dock dimensions with a laser measure, and taken 40 photographs of the shoreline for his engineering team. The dock was everything he had hoped for. Deep channel access, natural wind shelter from the rock formation to the north, and enough berth space for 3 mid-size cargo vessels simultaneously. This single piece of infrastructure could cut his northeast distribution costs by 30%. The main house had been aired out by a local property management company before his arrival. The furniture was old money, heavy oak dining tables, leather armchairs, brass fixtures that had probably been polished by the same housekeeper for 30 years. Julian didn't care about the decor. He cared about the dining room because it had a large table where he could spread out his work, and because the kitchen was stocked with enough provisions for a week. He had his shipping manifests laid across the dining table by the time Chloe knocked on the open doorframe at 7:15. Julian looked up. She had changed out of her canvas apron into a simple dark blue blouse and trousers. Her hair was still pulled back, though slightly neater than before. She was holding a casserole dish covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Calloway from the village drops off meals on Tuesdays," Chloe said. "She's been doing it since Dr. Hargrove's time. She made enough for 2 when she heard the new owner had arrived. I figured we could eat like civilized people instead of pretending the other one doesn't exist." Julian almost smiled. Almost. He cleared one end of the table, and Chloe set out the casserole. Roasted chicken with root vegetables and a crusty bread that smelled like it had come out of the oven an hour ago. They ate across from each other, and for a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was surprisingly comfortable. Julian broke it first. "Your research. What exactly are you studying out there?" "Soil-borne pathogens and their interaction with engineered biological compounds," Chloe said, buttering a piece of bread. "Specifically, how certain plant-derived enzymes can be modified to target organic materials. It has applications in agriculture, waste management, even industrial contamination cleanup." "Sounds expensive." "The grant covers my materials. Dr. Hargrove gave me the space. That was the arrangement." Julian nodded and went back to his manifests. He had been reviewing a troubling pattern for the past 3 weeks. Cargo losses across his northeast shipping lanes had spiked dramatically over the last quarter. Containers arriving with damaged goods, sealants failing on crates that should have held up for months. Organic materials, particularly high-value timber and textile shipments, deteriorating in transit at rates that made no sense. His logistics analysts had blamed weather, humidity fluctuations, and poor storage conditions at the regional hubs. Julian didn't buy any of it. He had been in this business for 20 years. Wood doesn't rot in a sealed container in 6 days. On the side table next to his chair, he had placed a raw sample from his latest shipment. A 12-inch plank of imported cedar timber, cut from a larger beam that had arrived at his Portland terminal yesterday. The timber was part of a high-value consignment bound for a furniture manufacturer in Vermont. 3 crates from the same shipment had already been flagged as damaged. Chloe glanced at the plank while reaching for her glass of water. She paused. Then she set the glass down and leaned slightly forward in her chair. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "My Portland terminal. Part of a cedar shipment from British Columbia." "May I?" Julian gestured for her to go ahead. Chloe picked up the plank and turned it under the dining room light. She ran her thumb along the edge of the grain, then held it at an angle, studying a section near the center. "You see this?" She brought the plank closer to the table lamp. "This faint greenish discoloration along the grain. It's very subtle. You'd miss it unless you were looking for exactly this." Julian leaned in. She was right. There was a barely visible tint running through the wood, almost like a watermark pressed into the grain. "That's a biological residue," Chloe said. "I've seen compounds like this in my research. It's an engineered plant enzyme, specifically designed to break down organic polymers, industrial sealants, natural fiber bindings, wood resin, anything organic. This compound will eat through it over a period of days." Julian stared at her. "You're telling me someone put this on my timber deliberately?" "I'm telling you this enzyme doesn't occur in nature. Somebody manufactured it and applied it to this wood. Cedar is naturally resistant to most biological degradation. That's why people build with it. For this kind of breakdown to happen, you'd need a targeted compound introduced after the wood was cut and treated." The room went very quiet. Julian picked up the plank and looked at the discoloration again. 3 months of cargo losses, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damaged goods. Insurance claims piling up, his analysts running models and blaming the weather, and the whole time, someone had been poisoning his shipments. "How certain are you about this?" Julian asked. His voice was calm, but his grip on the plank had tightened. "I've spent 11 years studying compounds exactly like this one. If you let me take a proper sample back to my lab, I can confirm the specific enzyme strain and tell you more about how it was applied. But based on what I'm seeing with my own eyes right now, I'm very certain." Julian set the plank down on the table between the dinner plates and the shipping manifests. The casserole was getting cold. Neither of them cared. "My company has lost close to $2 million in cargo damage this quarter," Julian said. "Every report I've received says it's environmental degradation. Normal wear, bad luck. It's none of those things," Chloe said. "Somebody is doing this to you on purpose, Mr. Vance, and they're using a very sophisticated tool to do it." Julian leaned back in his chair and looked at Chloe Mercer. 8 hours ago, she had been an obstacle, a complication attached to a property deed that his lawyers should have caught, a woman standing between him and a clean development plan for his dock. Now she was the only person in his entire organization who had looked at his problem and told him the truth. "Tomorrow morning," Julian said, "my team will deliver sealed samples from 3 of my regional hubs. Can your lab handle that kind of analysis?" Chloe folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. "Bring them by 9. I'll have results before lunch." She stood, collected the casserole dish, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "You should eat something, Mr. Vance. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Then she was gone, and Julian sat alone at the dining table, surrounded by manifests that suddenly told a very different story than the one he had been reading for months. Julian was awake by 5. He hadn't slept well. His mind had been turning over Chloe's words like a machine, grinding through raw material, and by the time the gray Maine dawn crept through the bedroom windows, he had already made 6 phone calls. The first 3 went to his regional hub managers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. He told each of them the same thing. Pull a sealed cargo sample from the most recent inbound shipment, pack it in a contamination-free container, and have it couriered to the Hargrove estate in Maine by 8:30 in the morning. No explanations, no questions. Just do it. The 4th call went to his chief of staff, Daniel Rowe, who picked up on the first ring despite the hour. "Cancel my meetings for today and tomorrow," Julian said. "All of them? Every single one." The 5th call went to his head of security. Julian wanted a full personnel roster for every employee with warehouse access at the Boston, New York, and Philadelphia terminals. Names, hire dates, shift schedules, supervisory chains. Everything. The 6th call was the one that bothered him the most. He called his chief logistics analyst, the man who had been filing quarterly reports, attributing the cargo losses to environmental factors. Julian asked him one question. "Did anyone on your team run a biological contamination screen on the damaged goods?" There was a pause. Then the analyst said, "No, sir. The damage profile was consistent with humidity exposure. We didn't see a reason to look beyond standard environmental causes." Julian hung up without saying goodbye. By 8:15, he was standing in the glasshouse, watching Chloe prepare her workspace. The transformation from the previous day was remarkable. Yesterday, the conservatory had looked like a lush garden with some scientific equipment scattered between the plants. This morning, Chloe had cleared an entire section of one long table and set up what could only be described as a functioning laboratory station. Glass beakers, pipettes, reagent bottles arranged in a precise row, a portable centrifuge, a UV light box, and a battered but clearly well-maintained microscope that looked like it had traveled across several universities before finding its home here. Everything was clean, organized, and positioned within arm's reach. Chloe moved through the setup with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "You built all of this from grant funding?" Julian asked. "Most of it came from surplus sales at university labs. When departments upgrade their equipment, the old gear goes for almost nothing if you know who to ask. The reagents are the expensive part. Those I order fresh." She calibrated the microscope lens without looking up. "Your samples, when do they arrive?" "Within the hour." At 8:40, Marcus brought 3 sealed containers into the glass house. Each one was marked with a regional hub code. Boston, New York, Philadelphia. The containers were heavy-duty plastic with airtight lids, the kind used for transporting sensitive materials. Julian had made sure the hub managers followed protocol. Chloe pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened the first container. Boston. Inside was a section of wooden pallet board, the kind used to stack and secure cargo inside shipping containers. She lifted it out carefully and placed it under the UV light box. Julian stood 3 feet behind her, arms crossed, watching every move. Under the ultraviolet light, the Boston sample lit up immediately. Faint trails of fluorescent green ran along the wood grain in an unmistakable pattern. It looked almost like veins running through the surface. "Same compound," Chloe said. "The enzyme fluoresces under UV because of its protein structure. You can see the application pattern here." She pointed with a gloved finger. "These trails are consistent with a fine mist sprayer. Someone applied this in a sweeping motion, probably holding the sprayer about 18 inches from the surface." She scraped a small section of the fluorescent residue into a glass vial, added 3 drops of a clear reagent, and placed the vial into a small rack. The liquid inside turned a deep amber within 30 seconds. "Positive for the engineered enzyme," Chloe confirmed. She wrote the result in her notebook and moved to the second container. "New York, another pallet board section." She repeated the process: UV light, inspection, sample scraping, reagent test. This time, under the ultraviolet, the wood showed nothing. Clean grain, no fluorescence, no trails. The reagent test came back clear. "Your New York hub is clean," Chloe said. "The third container, Philadelphia, same procedure, same careful movements." Julian noticed that Chloe's hands never hesitated. She didn't second-guess her measurements or recheck her reagent doses. Every action was practiced and precise, built on years of doing exactly this kind of work. The Philadelphia sample came back clean as well. Chloe set down her instruments and pulled off her gloves. She turned to Julian. "The enzyme is present only on the Boston samples. Your other 2 hubs are unaffected. Whatever is happening to your cargo, it's originating from one location." Julian absorbed this. Boston was his largest East Coast distribution point. Nearly 40% of his regional cargo volume moved through that terminal. If the contamination was isolated there, it meant whoever was behind this had direct access to the Boston facility and was operating from inside his own operation. "Can you tell me anything else about the enzyme itself?" Julian asked. Chloe walked to her microscope and placed a prepared slide under the lens. She adjusted the focus and studied the sample for a full minute before speaking. "This isn't something you can order from a chemical supplier. The protein chain has been modified at the molecular level to target specific organic polymers. Whoever designed this understood exactly what materials your cargo containers use for sealing and binding. They built this enzyme to attack those specific compounds. It's precise work, almost elegant, honestly." "Elegant," Julian repeated. "From a biochemistry standpoint, yes. From a business standpoint, someone spent real money developing this. We're talking about a custom-engineered biological agent designed for a very specific purpose." destroying your cargo from the inside while making it look like natural decay. Julian walked to the glasshouse door and looked out across the grounds toward the ocean. The morning fog was burning off, and he could see the dock pilings standing dark against the silver water. Somebody inside his Boston operation was systematically destroying his shipments using a weapon so sophisticated that his entire analytics team had mistaken it for bad weather. This wasn't a disgruntled employee stealing boxes off the loading dock. This was calculated, funded, and engineered. "I need to go to Boston," Julian said. Chloe closed her notebook. "Tonight? Tonight. After dark. I want to inspect the warehouse floor before anyone knows I'm coming. If this compound is being applied at the Boston hub, the equipment used to spray it should still be somewhere in that facility." "You'll need someone who can identify the sprayer residue on site," Chloe said. Julian turned back to face her. For a moment, he weighed the decision. Bringing an outside civilian into the operational heart of his company was something he had never done. His organization ran on controlled access. Need to know. Compartmentalized information. Trusting a woman he had met less than 24 hours ago went against every instinct he had built his career on. But every instinct he had built his career on had also failed to catch someone poisoning his cargo for 3 straight months. "Pack a bag, Miss Mercer. We leave at 9. The drive from coastal Maine to Boston took 3.5 hours. Marcus kept the black SUV at a steady pace down I-95, headlights cutting through a light coastal fog that thickened as they moved south. Julian sat in the front passenger seat, reviewing warehouse schematics on his tablet. Chloe sat in the back with a small duffel bag on the seat beside her, containing a portable UV lamp, sample collection vials, and a compact reagent kit she had assembled before leaving the estate. They didn't talk much during the drive. Julian appreciated that. He had spent too many car rides with executives who felt the need to fill silence with chatter about quarterly projections or golf handicaps. Chloe looked out the window for the first hour, then closed her eyes and slept for the second. She woke up without any grogginess as they crossed into the Boston metro area, checked her watch, and started organizing her kit. Professional, Julian thought. Whatever else she was professional. The Vance Global Docking Hub sat on a 12-acre parcel in South Boston's industrial waterfront district. During the day, it was a controlled chaos of forklifts, container trucks, and dock workers moving cargo on tight schedules. At midnight on a Wednesday, it was a different place entirely. Skeleton crew, automated security cameras, a handful of night shift workers handling paperwork and light maintenance in the administrative trailer near the front gate. Marcus parked the SUV 2 blocks away at Julian's instruction. They would enter through the secondary access gate on the east side of the property, using Julian's master keycard. No sign-in at the guard station, no advance notice. Julian wanted to see the warehouse floor exactly as it existed when nobody was expecting the owner to walk through. The east gate opened without a sound. Julian led Chloe across a paved yard where empty container chassis were lined up in neat rows, their steel frames gleaming dull orange under the sodium lights overhead. The main warehouse was a massive steel structure, 200 feet long, with rolling bay doors large enough to drive a semi-truck through. A single bay door on the far end was open about 3 feet, spilling a wedge of fluorescent light onto the concrete outside. Julian paused at the open bay door and listened. Inside, he could hear the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant beeping of a forklift somewhere deeper in the building. Standard night shift sounds. He ducked under the bay door and held it for Chloe. She stepped through with her UV lamp already in hand, powered on but held low against her leg so the purple glow wouldn't draw attention from a distance. The warehouse interior was organized into long rows of industrial racking, each row stretching nearly the full length of the building. Palletized cargo filled the lower racks. Crates of various sizes, wrapped in industrial shrink film, stacked 3 and 4 high. Labels indicated destinations across the Northeast: Vermont, Connecticut, New Hampshire, upstate New York. "Where do outgoing shipments stage before loading?" Chloe whispered. Julian pointed toward the far end of the warehouse. "Loading zone is in the last 4 rows, near the main bay doors. Cargo gets staged there during the afternoon shift, then loaded onto trucks between midnight and 4 in the morning." They moved down the center aisle, staying close to the racking. Julian walked with the confidence of a man who owned every square inch of the floor beneath him, but he kept his footsteps quiet out of tactical habit. Chloe matched his pace, her eyes scanning the racks on both sides as they passed. When they reached the staging area, Chloe raised her UV lamp and swept it across the nearest row of palletized crates. The purple light washed over the shrink-wrapped surfaces, revealing nothing unusual on the first 2 pallets. On the third, faint fluorescent traces appeared along the edges of the wooden pallet boards. The same greenish glow she had identified in the lab that morning. "It's here," she said quietly. "Applied within the last 12 hours, based on the fluorescence intensity." She moved down the row systematically, checking each pallet. Out of 14 staged shipments, 6 showed traces of the enzyme compound. Chloe noted each one in a small pocket notebook, recording the shipment label codes and the location of the contamination. "The application is concentrated on the pallet boards and the lower edges of the crates," she said. "Wherever the wood contacts the cargo packaging, once the enzyme activates, it migrates through the sealant layer and into the goods inside. Very deliberate placement." Julian crouched beside one of the contaminated pallets and examined the fluorescent residue. Even under the UV light, the traces were so faint that they would be invisible under normal warehouse lighting. No dock worker loading crates at 2 in the morning would ever spot this. "The sprayer," Julian said. "Where would someone store it in here?" Chloe stood and looked around the staging area. The application pattern suggests a handheld pump sprayer, something small enough to carry in one hand. "You could store it anywhere, but if you're using it regularly on the night shift, you'd keep it somewhere accessible, somewhere a maintenance tool wouldn't look out of place." Julian walked to a row of metal utility cabinets mounted on the wall near the loading dock doors. Cleaning supplies, safety equipment, spare packing materials. He opened the first 3 cabinets. Nothing unusual. The 4th cabinet, positioned closest to the staging area, contained a shelf of solvent bottles and cleaning rags on top. On the bottom shelf, tucked behind a box of disposable gloves, sat a small plastic pump sprayer with a faded green label. Chloe crouched beside him and aimed her UV lamp at the sprayer nozzle. The tip erupted in bright fluorescent green. Residue caked around the nozzle opening and down the side of the bottle where liquid had dripped during use. "That's your delivery system," Chloe said. She unscrewed the cap carefully and held the opening under the UV light. The inside of the reservoir glowed like a lantern. There's still compound inside, enough for probably another dozen applications. Julian stared at the sprayer. A $12 piece of plastic hardware from any garden supply store. That was the weapon someone had used to drain nearly $2 million from his company. "Can you trace the compound inside to a specific manufacturer or source?" he asked. "The enzyme itself is custom, but the carrier solution it's dissolved in will have chemical markers. I can break that down in my lab. It might give us a production signature." Julian carefully lifted the sprayer using a clean rag from the cabinet and placed it into a plastic evidence bag Chloe produced from her kit. She sealed it, labeled it with the date, time, and location, and placed it in her duffel bag alongside the other samples. They stood together in the fluorescent glow of the loading dock, surrounded by $2 million worth of cargo that someone on Julian's own payroll had been quietly destroying for months. "Whoever is running this has night shift access to the staging area," Julian said. "That narrows it down to about 15 people. Dock workers, shift supervisors, and one regional manager." "The regional manager," Chloe said. "Who runs this facility?" "A man named Arthur Pendleton. He's been with the company for 9 years. Chloe zipped her duffel bag closed. "Then I'd suggest you start with his paperwork before you start with his people. If he's involved, the records will show it. They always do." Julian took one last look at the staging area, memorizing the layout, the cabinet positions, the numbered rack rows. Then he turned toward the bay door. "We drive back tonight," he said. "I want to be at my downtown office when it opens in the morning." Chloe shouldered her bag and followed him out into the cool Boston night. Behind them, the warehouse hummed on, the night shift crew completely unaware that their boss had just walked through their operation and found exactly what he was looking for. Julian's downtown Boston office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Atlantic Avenue, close enough to the harbor that he could see container ships moving through the channel from his desk. He had built Vance Global Logistics from a single leased warehouse in Revere 20 years ago, and this office was the command center of everything that had grown from it. 6 regional hubs, a fleet of 200 trucks, contracts with manufacturers across 12 countries, and a payroll of over 3,000 employees. He walked through the lobby at 7:15 in the morning, still wearing the same clothes from the midnight warehouse run. Chloe had gone to a hotel 2 blocks away to shower and change. Julian didn't bother. He had worked longer stretches on less sleep during port strikes and customs disputes that would have broken weaker men. Daniel Rowe, his chief of staff, was already waiting outside his office with a coffee and a tablet full of messages. Daniel was a thin, precise man in his early 40s who had worked for Julian for 12 years and had learned early on that the best way to serve his boss was to have answers ready before the questions were asked. "Personnel roster for the Boston hub is on your desk," Daniel said, handing Julian the coffee. "Shift schedules for the past 6 months, access logs for the warehouse and the loading docks, and the org chart for Arthur Pendleton's division. Also, your logistics analyst called twice this morning. He sounded nervous." "He should be," Julian said, and walked into his office. The personnel files took up a 2-inch stack on the left side of his desk. Julian ignored them for now. He sat down at his computer and pulled up the internal document management system, navigating to the Boston hub's operational records. Specifically, he wanted the damage reports. Every time cargo arrived at a destination in damaged condition, the receiving party filed a claim. That claim went back to the originating hub, where the regional manager was responsible for investigating the cause, documenting the findings, and submitting a damage report to corporate headquarters. Those reports determined whether the company absorbed the loss, filed an insurance claim, or pursued recovery against a third-party carrier. Julian pulled every damage report filed by the Boston hub for the past 12 months. There were 47 of them. He arranged them chronologically on his screen and started reading. The first thing he noticed was the language. Every single report used almost identical phrasing. Environmental degradation due to humidity exposure during transit. Recommended disposition, insurance recovery. It was copy-paste work. 47 individual incidents, each one supposedly investigated independently, and every conclusion was the same. Arthur Pendleton had signed off on all of them. Julian opened the insurance recovery records next. Each damage report had triggered a claim with the company's cargo insurance provider. Total payouts over 12 months came to just under $1.8 million. The money had been deposited into the company's operating accounts, processed through the Boston hub's regional finance office, and reconciled against the quarterly loss statements that Julian's analysts reviewed every 3 months. On the surface, everything looked clean. Cargo gets damaged, insurance pays out, the company recovers its losses, standard procedure. The numbers balanced. But Julian had been running numbers his entire adult life, and something in these records felt wrong. He pulled up the original shipping manifests for the damaged shipments and cross-referenced them against the damage reports. That's when the pattern emerged. 14 of the 47 damaged shipments involved high-value specialty goods. Premium cedar timber, artisanal textiles, handcrafted furniture components. These items had specific destination clients who had paid premium rates for guaranteed delivery. According to the damage reports, these 14 shipments had been destroyed and written off as total losses. Julian then pulled the outbound transfer logs for the Boston hub. These logs tracked every item that left the warehouse, including goods flagged for disposal or return. He searched for the 14 shipment codes. None of them appeared in the disposal records. Not a single one. 14 shipments worth over $900,000 in premium goods had been declared destroyed for insurance purposes, but there was no record of those goods ever being disposed of, returned to the sender, or scrapped. They had simply vanished from the system after the damage reports were filed. Julian leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just sabotaging cargo. He was selecting the most valuable shipments, applying the enzyme compound to create convincing damage, filing insurance claims to recover the full value, and then diverting the actual goods somewhere else entirely. The insurance money went into the company's accounts, where it looked like a legitimate recovery. The cargo itself went somewhere off the books. Julian picked up his phone and called his forensic accounting team. "I need a full trace on 14 shipment codes. I'm sending you the list now. I want to know if any of these goods surfaced at another distributor, reseller, or auction house within 60 days of their reported damage date. Check everything. Bill of lading records, customs filings, secondary market databases. Start with competitors in the Northeast Corridor." He hung up and sent the list. 20 minutes later, his forensic team called back with preliminary results. 8 of the 14 shipments had been traced to a mid-sized distribution company called Northline Freight, operating out of Providence, Rhode Island. Northline had received the goods through a series of intermediary brokers, paying roughly 40 cents on the dollar for premium materials that were supposedly destroyed. The transactions were structured to avoid triggering any automated compliance flags. Julian wrote the name on a notepad and circled it. Northline Freight. He would deal with them later. Right now, the priority was Arthur Pendleton. He pulled up Arthur's employee file. 9 years with the company. Promoted to regional manager of the Boston hub 4 years ago. Performance reviews were consistently strong. Attendance record was perfect. No disciplinary actions, no complaints, no red flags of any kind. That was the thing about betrayal from the inside. It never came from the people you were already watching. It came from the ones who had spent years making sure you never had a reason to look in their direction. Daniel knocked on the door. "Miss Mercer is downstairs in the lobby. Should I send her up?" "Bring her to the main conference room," Julian said, "and get Arthur Pendleton on the phone. Tell him I'm calling a regional performance review for the Boston hub tomorrow afternoon. Standard procedure. Nothing urgent." Daniel nodded and left. Julian closed the files on his screen and picked up his coffee. It had gone cold, but he drank it anyway. He had 14 phantom shipments, a forensic trail leading to a rival distributor, and a regional manager who had been robbing him blind while filing perfect attendance reports. Tomorrow, Arthur Pendleton would walk into a meeting thinking he was going to discuss quarterly performance metrics. He had no idea that the woman he had never met and the boss he thought he had fooled were about to take apart his entire operation, piece by piece. The conference room on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Julian had chosen this room deliberately for the meeting with his executive board, but that meeting was scheduled for tomorrow. Today, the room belonged to Chloe. She arrived at 9:30, carrying her duffel bag and a thick folder of handwritten notes from the lab tests. Julian had arranged for a workstation to be set up at one end of the long conference table. Laptop, printer, scanner, and a secure connection to the company's internal analytics platform. Chloe sat down, opened her folder, and began organizing her findings into a structured report without asking for instructions. Julian watched her work for a few minutes from the doorway. She moved through data the same way she moved through her glasshouse. Methodical, unhurried, and completely absorbed. He left her alone and went back to his office to coordinate with his forensic accounting team. By 11 o'clock, the first sign of trouble arrived. Daniel Rowe knocked on Julian's door and stepped inside with an expression that Julian recognized immediately. It was the face Daniel made when he was about to deliver information that someone was going to regret. Arthur Pendleton just filed a formal administrative complaint through the corporate compliance office, Daniel said. He placed a printed document on Julian's desk. He's citing unauthorized civilian access to proprietary company assets. Specifically, he's claiming that an unverified individual was observed handling sealed cargo samples from the Boston hub without proper clearance or chain of custody documentation. Julian picked up the complaint and read it. Arthur's language was careful and bureaucratic. He didn't mention Chloe by name, but the description was unmistakable. An unidentified woman working with materials removed from company facilities under questionable authorization. The complaint requested an immediate internal audit of the sample handling process and a suspension of any testing conducted by outside parties until credentials could be verified through proper channels. Julian set the document down. When was this filed? 40 minutes ago. It went through the compliance portal, which means it's already flagged in the system. The compliance director sent me a copy as a courtesy because your name is attached to the sample requisition orders. Julian leaned back in his chair. Arthur was smart. The man had spent 9 years learning exactly how the corporate machinery worked, and now he was using it as a shield. By filing a compliance complaint, he was creating an official paper trail that cast doubt on Chloe's involvement and, by extension, on any evidence she had gathered. If the compliance office launched a formal review, the investigation could get tangled in procedural red tape for weeks. Enough time for Arthur to cover his tracks, destroy records, or simply disappear. Has the compliance director taken any action yet? Julian asked. She's waiting for your response before escalating. She knows you authorized the samples personally, but the complaint creates an obligation to follow up. Company policy. Julian stood and picked up the complaint document. Set up a meeting in the main conference room. Me, the compliance director, and Arthur Pendleton. 1 o'clock today. Arthur is in Boston at the hub. He can conference in by video. Even better, I want him on screen where the compliance director can see his face while I respond to this. At 1 o'clock, Julian sat at the head of the conference table with the compliance director, Margaret Chen, seated to his right. Margaret was a careful, experienced attorney who had been managing Vance Global's internal compliance for 7 years. She was thorough, fair, and impossible to push around, which was exactly why Julian had hired her. Arthur Pendleton appeared on the wall-mounted screen via video link from the Boston Hub's administrative office. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the calm, measured demeanor of someone who had rehearsed his lines. He greeted Julian and Margaret with appropriate formality and expressed his concern for the integrity of company procedures. Julian let him talk for exactly 3 minutes. Then he opened a folder on the table in front of him. "Arthur, I appreciate your diligence in filing this complaint. Let me address it directly." Julian placed the complaint document on the table, where Margaret could see it. "The individual you're referring to is Dr. Chloe Mercer, a research botanist under a long-term contract at a property I personally own. I authorized her involvement in testing cargo samples from our regional hubs as part of a quality assurance review that I initiated. Her access to company materials falls under my authority as owner and chief executive." Arthur's expression didn't change, but Julian noticed a slight shift in his posture, a tightening of the shoulders. "With respect, Mr. Vance," Arthur said, "our protocols require that any outside party handling company inventory be vetted through the compliance office. I was simply following procedure. And I'm telling you that I personally vetted her credentials and authorized her access. That supersedes the standard vetting process." Julian turned to Margaret. "For the record, I'm formally designating Dr. Mercer as an external consultant to Vance Global, with full access to the company's analytical auditing tools, effective immediately. Please update the compliance records accordingly." Margaret made a note on her tablet. "I'll process the authorization this afternoon. The complaint will be marked as resolved, pending your executive override." On the screen, Arthur nodded slowly. "Of course. I just wanted to make sure we were following the proper channels. No offense intended toward Dr. Mercer or her work." "None taken," Julian said. "And Arthur, since we're discussing the Boston hub, I'd like you to prepare a full operational summary for the board meeting tomorrow afternoon. Standard quarterly format. Cargo volumes, damage rates, insurance recoveries, absolutely." "Absolutely. I'll have it ready." Julian closed the folder. "That's all for now. Thank you, Margaret." The video link disconnected. Margaret gathered her things and left the conference room. Julian sat alone at the table for a moment, then walked down the hall to the workstation, where Chloe was assembling her report. She looked up when he came in. "How did it go?" "He tried to get you thrown off the investigation by filing a compliance complaint. Claimed you were an unauthorized civilian tampering with company inventory." Chloe's expression didn't waver. "That means he knows someone was in the warehouse last night. He knows something is happening. He doesn't know how much we've found yet. I've given you full access to the company's auditing tools, everything you need to build a complete scientific report, chemical analysis, contamination mapping, enzyme identification. I want a document so airtight that no lawyer, no compliance officer, and no board member can poke a single hole in it." Chloe turned back to her laptop. "When do you need it?" "Tomorrow afternoon. The board meets at 2. She pulled up the analytics platform and began navigating through the database. "Then I should get back to work, Mr. Vance." Julian paused at the door. Arthur Pendleton had just made his first defensive move, and it told Julian everything he needed to know. An innocent man doesn't file a compliance complaint against someone he's never met for conducting tests he shouldn't even know about. Arthur was watching, and Arthur was scared. Good, scared people make mistakes. And Julian was going to give him exactly 24 hours to make his next one. Julian and Chloe left Boston at 6 in the evening and drove back to the main estate. The report needed to be finalized using Chloe's original lab samples, the ones she had preserved from the initial tests, along with the sprayer they had recovered from the warehouse cabinet. Those physical specimens were the foundation of everything. Without them, the chemical analysis was just data on a screen. With them, it was courtroom-grade evidence. They arrived at the estate a little after 9:30. The fog had rolled in heavy off the Atlantic, wrapping the property in a damp gray blanket that muffled every sound. The main house was dark. The glass house glowed faintly from the interior grow lights that Chloe kept on a timer for her plants. Chloe went straight to her lab station and began working. Julian stayed in the main house, spreading the financial documents he had printed from the Boston office across the dining room table. He needed to organize the forensic accounting trail alongside Chloe's scientific findings so the board presentation would tell a single, coherent story. Chemical evidence on one side, financial fraud on the other, both pointing at the same man. He worked until midnight, then slept for 4 hours in one of the upstairs bedrooms. At 5:15 in the morning, Julian woke to the sound of tires on gravel. He was at the window in 3 seconds. Through the fog, he could see headlights coming up the estate's main drive. A dark sedan, moving slowly, parking near the courtyard between the main house and the glass house. 2 men stepped out. They wore dark jackets with Vance Global Security printed on the back in reflective lettering. Julian pulled on his shoes and was downstairs and out the front door before the 2 men reached the glass house entrance. "Hold it," he called out. The 2 men stopped and turned. Julian recognized neither of them. They were younger, early 30s maybe, with the rigid posture of men who had been given specific orders and intended to follow them without deviation. One of them was carrying a set of heavy-duty plastic storage bins. The other had a clipboard. "Mr. Vance," the one with the clipboard said, "we're here on behalf of corporate security to conduct an internal audit of materials stored on company-associated property. We have authorization to collect and catalog any items related to ongoing quality assurance testing." Julian walked toward them slowly. "Authorization from whom?" The man with the clipboard glanced at his partner, then back at Julian. "The directive came through the Boston Regional Office, standard internal audit procedure, following a compliance flag. Show me the authorization document." The man flipped a page on his clipboard and held it out. Julian took it and read it under the glow of the courtyard lamp. The document was formatted on Vance Global letterhead, citing the compliance complaint that Arthur Pendleton had filed the previous day. It referenced a directive to secure all physical samples and testing materials related to the flagged quality assurance review. The authorization was signed by Arthur Pendleton, Regional Manager, Boston Hub. Julian looked up from the clipboard. "Arthur Pendleton doesn't have the authority to order an audit on my personal property. This estate is privately owned. It's not a company facility. Sir, our instructions were to collect the materials and transport them to the Boston Hub for cataloging. Your instructions are invalid." Julian handed the clipboard back. "Arthur Pendleton is a regional manager. He has authority over the Boston warehouse and its operations. He has zero jurisdiction over anything on these grounds. This is private property, and you are standing on it without the owner's permission." The 2 men exchanged a look. The one with the storage bins shifted his weight. Julian could tell they were not prepared for this conversation. They had expected to arrive early, before anyone was awake, collect the samples and leave. A quick, clean operation. In and out, before the botanist in the glass house even knew they had been there. "Mr. Vance, we were told this was a routine procedure." The one with the clipboard tried again. "There is nothing routine about 2 men showing up on my property at 5 in the morning to confiscate evidence related to an active investigation. You were sent here by Arthur Pendleton to remove samples that prove his involvement in cargo sabotage and insurance fraud. You either knew that when you accepted this assignment or you didn't bother to ask." Neither man spoke. "Here's what happens now," Julian said. His voice was level and deliberate. "You are both terminated from Vance Global Security, effective immediately. Leave your company identification badges and any company-issued equipment in the car. My chief of staff will process your separation paperwork by end of business today. If you set foot on this property again, you will be dealing with local law enforcement, and I will personally ensure that trespassing charges are filed." The man with the clipboard opened his mouth, then closed it. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his badge, and placed it on the hood of the sedan. His partner did the same, setting down the storage bins on the gravel. "Get in your car and leave," Julian said. They left. The sedan backed down the drive and disappeared into the fog. Julian stood in the courtyard until the sound of the engine faded completely, then walked to the glass house. Chloe was standing inside the door. She had watched the entire exchange through the glass panels. "They came for the samples," she said. "Arthur sent them. He used a fabricated audit order to authorize the confiscation. He's trying to destroy the physical evidence before the board meeting this afternoon." Chloe looked at her lab station. The original test samples were lined up in labeled vials on the table. The sealed sprayer from the warehouse sat in its evidence bag on the shelf beside the microscope. 11 years of careful, methodical research had taught her how to preserve specimens through funding cuts, equipment failures, and New England winters. She was not about to lose them to a pair of errand boys with plastic bins. "I have duplicates of every sample stored in a secondary containment case," she said, "and my lab notebook documents the full chain of custody from the moment each specimen was collected. Even if they had taken everything on this table, the duplicate set and the written record would still hold up." Julian nodded. "From now on, nothing stays unguarded. I'm moving the primary samples and the sprayer into my personal safe in the main house. Combination lock, fireproof, bolted to the foundation. Nobody gets to them without going through me." They spent the next 30 minutes transferring the critical evidence into the safe. Julian recorded each item as Chloe handed it over, creating a joint custody log that both of them signed and dated. When the safe door closed, Julian spun the combination lock and stood up. "How far along is the report?" he asked. 90%. I need 2 more hours to finalize the enzyme analysis and format the contamination mapping data. It'll be ready before noon." "Good. We leave for Boston at 12:30. The board meets at 2. Chloe went back to the glass house. Julian made coffee in the main house kitchen and stood at the window, watching the fog thin as the morning sun climbed over the Atlantic. Arthur Pendleton had just played his last card, and he had played it badly. Sending men to steal evidence from the estate of the company's owner was the act of someone who had run out of clever options. The compliance complaint had failed. The confiscation attempt had failed. All Arthur had left now was the hope that Julian didn't have enough proof to bring him down in front of the full board. That hope was sitting in a fireproof safe, with a combination only Julian knew. The Vance Global boardroom occupied a corner suite on the 16th floor of the Atlantic Avenue Tower. It was designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table that seated 18, walls lined with framed photographs of cargo vessels and port facilities spanning 2 decades of company history, and a presentation screen large enough to display shipping manifests in font sizes that left no room for ambiguity. Julian had conducted over 100 meetings in this room. Terminations, acquisitions, contract negotiations, crisis responses. The room had seen all of it. Today, it was going to see something new. The board members began arriving at 1:30. 7 executives in total, each responsible for a major division of Vance Global's operations. Finance, legal, human resources, fleet operations, international trade, risk management, and client relations. They filed in with their tablets and coffee cups, exchanging the usual small talk about weekend plans and market conditions. None of them knew why this meeting had been called on 48 hours' notice. Julian had told Daniel to use the phrase strategic operational review in the calendar invitation, which was vague enough to mean anything and specific enough to ensure full attendance. Arthur Pendleton arrived at 1:45. He walked into the boardroom with a leather portfolio under his arm and a calm, pleasant expression on his face. He shook hands with two of the board members he knew well, poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the side table, and took his usual seat halfway down the left side of the table. Julian noted all of this from his office across the hall, where he was reviewing the final version of Chloe's report on his laptop. She had delivered it at 11:30 that morning, exactly as promised. 42 pages of chemical analysis, contamination mapping, enzyme identification, chain of custody documentation, and photographic evidence from the warehouse inspection. Every claim was supported by data. Every data point was cross-referenced against a physical specimen currently locked in Julian's personal safe. It was, without question, the most thorough piece of investigative work Julian had ever seen, produced by a single person in under 72 hours. Chloe was waiting in Daniel's office down the hall, reviewing her notes. She had changed into a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, which Julian suspected was the most formal outfit she owned. She looked composed, though Julian noticed she was turning a pen between her fingers in a slow, repetitive motion, the only sign that she was aware of what was about to happen in that boardroom. At 2 o'clock exactly, Julian walked into the boardroom with Chloe beside him. The small talk stopped. 7 pairs of eyes tracked them to the head of the table. Arthur Pendleton looked up from his water glass and saw Chloe for the first time. Something moved behind his eyes. A quick flash of recognition, then nothing. His expression reset to neutral in under a second. Julian remained standing. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. I want to introduce Dr. Chloe Mercer, an independent botanical research scientist who has been assisting me with a quality assurance investigation over the past 4 days. She is here today as an expert witness." Chloe took a seat at the far end of the table near the presentation screen. She opened her folder and placed her notes in front of her without speaking. "Over the past quarter," Julian continued, "this company has sustained approximately $1.8 million in cargo losses attributed to environmental degradation during transit. Our logistics analysts concluded that humidity exposure and poor storage conditions were responsible. That conclusion is wrong." He clicked a remote, and the presentation screen lit up with the first slide of Chloe's report. A high-resolution photograph of the cedar timber sample under UV light. The fluorescent green enzyme trails clearly visible along the wood grain. "What you're looking at is an engineered biological compound applied deliberately to our cargo at the Boston distribution hub. This enzyme is designed to break down organic polymers, specifically the industrial sealants and natural fiber bindings used in our packaging. It causes progressive deterioration that mimics natural environmental damage. Dr. Mercer identified this compound during an unrelated conversation 4 days ago, and subsequent testing has confirmed its presence across multiple Boston shipments." Julian advanced to the next slide, a side-by-side comparison of the 3 hub samples. Boston positive, New York clean, Philadelphia clean. The contamination is isolated to our Boston facility. No other regional hub is affected. Dr. Mercer conducted chemical analysis on sealed samples from 3 hubs and confirmed that the enzyme is present only on goods processed through the Boston terminal. The room was silent. Arthur Pendleton had not moved. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes were fixed on the screen with an expression of careful attention, as if he were studying the findings with the same concern as everyone else in the room. Julian advanced to the next slide. The photograph of the pump sprayer recovered from the warehouse cabinet, its nozzle glowing under UV light. During a physical inspection of the Boston warehouse, Dr. Mercer and I located the application device, a handheld pump sprayer stored in a utility cabinet adjacent to the outgoing cargo staging area. The sprayer contains residual compound consistent with the enzyme found on the contaminated shipments. It has been preserved with full chain of custody documentation. He clicked again. The screen now displayed a spreadsheet. 47 damage reports, all filed from the Boston hub, all signed by the same name. 47 damage reports over 12 months. Every single one attributed to environmental causes. Every single one signed off by the Boston regional manager. Julian paused and looked directly at Arthur. 14 of those reports involved high-value specialty goods, declared as total losses for insurance purposes. Our forensic accounting team has traced 8 of those 14 shipments to a distribution company called Northline Freight in Providence, Rhode Island, where they were resold through intermediary brokers at approximately 40 cents on the dollar. Arthur's composure cracked. It was subtle, a slight tightening of the jaw, a barely perceptible shift in his seated posture. But in a room full of executives trained to read body language across negotiating tables, it was enough. The cargo was never destroyed, Julian said. It was sabotaged to create the appearance of damage, reported as a loss to trigger insurance recovery, and then diverted to a secondary buyer for additional profit. The insurance payouts went into our company accounts to cover the apparent losses. The resale revenue went somewhere else entirely. Julian turned to Chloe. Dr. Mercer, would you walk the board through the chemical findings? Chloe stood and moved to the presentation screen. She spoke for 12 minutes, walking through the enzyme analysis, the fluorescence testing methodology, the contamination mapping data, and the chain of custody log for every specimen collected. She spoke clearly, without jargon, translating complex biochemistry into language that a room full of business executives could follow without confusion. She answered 3 questions from the risk management director and 2 from the legal counsel, each time responding with specific data points from her report. When she finished, she returned to her seat. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Julian looked at Arthur. Arthur, do you have anything you'd like to say to the board? Arthur Pendleton stared at the spreadsheet on the screen for a long moment. Then he closed his leather portfolio, pushed his chair back from the table, and said the only honest thing he had said in over a year. I want to speak with my attorney. Julian nodded to the head of legal. Please escort Mr. Pendleton to a private office and arrange for his counsel to be contacted. His access to all company systems, facilities, and personnel is suspended effective immediately. Arthur stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the boardroom without looking at anyone. The door closed behind him, and Julian turned back to the 6 remaining board members. We have work to do, he said, and we're going to start right now. The board meeting ran until 6 o'clock that evening. After Arthur's departure, Julian spent 3 hours working through the operational implications with his remaining executives. The Boston hub couldn't shut down. It handled 40% of the company's East Coast volume, and any disruption would cascade through delivery schedules for dozens of clients within days. The challenge was to clean the facility, replace the compromised leadership, and restore integrity to the operation without losing a single contract. Julian appointed his fleet operations director, Sandra Liu, as interim manager of the Boston hub, effective immediately. Sandra had run the New York terminal for 5 years before moving to the corporate team, and she understood port operations at a ground level that most executives never bothered to learn. She was on a train to Boston before the meeting ended. The larger concern, the one that kept Julian's mind working long after the boardroom emptied, was whether Boston was truly the only infected hub. Chloe's tests had cleared New York and Philadelphia, but Vance Global operated 6 regional terminals along the East Coast. The remaining 3, in Baltimore, Norfolk, and Jacksonville, hadn't been tested. Arthur Pendleton's scheme had been sophisticated enough to evade detection for over a year. Julian couldn't afford to assume the contamination hadn't spread to facilities beyond Arthur's direct control. He could have shared the compound with contacts at other hubs, Chloe said during the drive back to the hotel that evening. If the enzyme formula was provided to him by an outside source, there's no guarantee it was provided only to him. Julian agreed. The next morning, he and Chloe flew to New York on the 7 o'clock shuttle from Logan Airport. The New York terminal was the logical starting point for two reasons. It was the second largest hub in the network, and it was the facility closest to Boston, sharing several of the same carrier routes and vendor relationships. If the contamination had jumped to another location, New York was the most likely candidate. The New York Regional Terminal sat on a sprawling industrial lot in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, wedged between a container yard and a municipal recycling facility. It was smaller than the Boston hub, but busier in certain ways, handling a higher volume of time-sensitive shipments for clients in Manhattan, northern New Jersey, and Connecticut. The regional QA team consisted of 4 full-time inspectors, supervised by a quality manager named David Yoon. David met Julian and Chloe at the terminal's main office at 10 in the morning. He was a compact, serious man in his late 30s, who had transferred to the New York hub from the company's international division 3 years ago. Julian had always considered David one of his more reliable middle managers, but after the Arthur Pendleton experience, Julian was done relying on assumptions about who could be trusted. "David, this is Dr. Chloe Mercer. She's going to be working with your QA team today. I need you to give her full access to your inspection stations, your storage facilities, and your cargo staging areas. Everything." David looked at Chloe, then back at Julian. "May I ask what this is about? We've identified a contamination issue at the Boston hub. An engineered biological compound has been applied to outgoing cargo, causing deliberate damage disguised as environmental degradation. I need Dr. Mercer to inspect your facility and train your team on how to detect the compound. This is a Priority 1 directive." David absorbed this without visible reaction. Then he picked up his desk phone and called his 4 QA inspectors to the main office. Within 30 minutes, Chloe was standing in the New York terminal's inspection bay, with David's team gathered around a stainless steel examination table. She had brought her portable UV lamp, a set of reagent testing kits, and a stack of printed reference sheets showing photographs of the enzyme fluorescence patterns from the Boston samples. She began with the basics. The compound you're looking for is invisible under normal lighting. It's applied as a fine mist, usually to wooden pallet boards and the lower edges of cargo crates, where the packaging contacts organic binding materials. The only reliable detection method in a field setting is ultraviolet light inspection. She switched on the UV lamp and demonstrated the technique on a clean pallet board she had pulled from the facility's supply stack. No fluorescence. Clean surface. Then she opened a sealed vial containing a diluted sample of the enzyme compound she had prepared specifically for training purposes and applied a small amount to a section of the board with a cotton swab. Under the UV lamp, the treated area glowed with the characteristic greenish fluorescence. "That's what you're looking for," Chloe said. "Any surface that shows this fluorescence pattern should be immediately quarantined and reported. Don't touch the affected area with bare hands. Use gloves. Isolate the item, and photograph the fluorescence under UV for documentation." The 4 QA inspectors leaned in, studying the glow pattern. One of them, a younger woman named Rachel, asked whether the compound could transfer from a contaminated pallet to a clean one through physical contact during stacking. "Good question," Chloe said. "Yes, cross-contamination is possible if wet compound transfers between surfaces, but the fluorescence will be fainter on a secondary contact surface. Look for smeared or streaked patterns, rather than the even mist distribution you'd see on a primary application." For the next 3 hours, Chloe walked the QA team through the entire inspection protocol. She showed them how to set up a UV screening station at the cargo staging area, how to perform the reagent confirmation test on any suspect samples, and how to document findings in a format that would hold up under corporate audit review. She ran each inspector through the process individually, watching them perform the steps on practice samples until she was satisfied they could execute the protocol independently. By 2 in the afternoon, the New York team had screened a random selection of 40 pallets from the current staging inventory. All 40 came back clean, no enzyme traces, no fluorescence. The New York hub was uncontaminated. David Yoon stood beside Julian at the edge of the inspection bay, watching his team work through the final round of practice screenings. How long was this happening in Boston before anyone caught it? Over a year, Julian said. David shook his head slowly. And our standard QA checks never would have picked it up. We don't screen for biological agents. It's not part of our protocol. It is now, Julian said. Dr. Mercer is going to draft a standardized detection protocol for every hub in the network. I want UV screening integrated into the outbound inspection process at all 6 terminals within 2 weeks. Chloe joined them after dismissing the QA team to begin implementing the screening stations. Your people here are sharp, she told Julian, Rachel especially. She asked better questions than most graduate students I've worked with. If you put her in charge of the detection program at this facility, she'll run it well. Julian made a mental note of the recommendation. He had spent 20 years building an organization where he made every significant decision himself. Delegating critical operational judgments to a botanist he had met 5 days ago was unfamiliar territory. But Chloe had earned something that very few people in Julian's professional life had ever managed to earn in such a short time. His confidence. And she had earned it with evidence, precision, and the complete absence of any personal agenda beyond solving the problem in front of her. Baltimore and Norfolk are next, Julian said. I'll have Daniel arrange site visits for tomorrow and the day after. Can you prepare training kits for both facilities? Chloe was already making a list in her notebook. I'll need more reagent supplies. I can order them tonight and have them shipped to each location ahead of our arrival. Do it. Expense everything through my office. They left the New York terminal at 4:30 and caught the evening shuttle back to Boston. Julian spent the flight reviewing the interim reports from Sandra Liu's first day managing the Boston hub. Chloe spent it writing the standardized detection protocol on her laptop, a document that would eventually be distributed to every quality assurance team in the Vance Global Network. Somewhere over Connecticut, Julian glanced across the aisle at Chloe, bent over her keyboard, completely focused. 5 days ago, she had been a complication attached to a property deed, an obstacle between him and a clean development plan for a deep-water dock in Maine. Now she was redesigning the quality infrastructure of his entire company. He turned back to his own screen and kept working. There were still 2 more hubs to secure, a legal case to build against Arthur Pendleton, and a board of directors that needed reassurance that the crisis was under control. The week was far from over. Julian spent the next 36 hours on the road with Chloe, visiting the Baltimore and Norfolk terminals in back-to-back trips. Both facilities came back clean. No enzyme traces, no fluorescence, no evidence that the contamination had spread beyond Boston. At each hub, Chloe trained the local QA teams using the same protocol she had developed in New York, and at each location, Julian appointed a lead inspector to oversee the new UV screening program on a permanent basis. By the morning of day 6, Julian was back in his Atlantic Avenue office with a complete picture of the situation. The contamination was confirmed as isolated to the Boston hub. All 6 regional terminals now had functioning detection protocols in place. Sandra Liu had stabilized operations in Boston, replacing the compromised night shift crew with vetted personnel transferred from other facilities. The immediate operational crisis was contained. Now came the part Julian had been building toward since the moment Chloe held a piece of cedar timber under a dining room lamp and told him someone was poisoning his cargo. At 8 o'clock, Julian sat down with his head of legal, Robert Ames, in the executive suite conference room. Robert was a tall, gray-haired man who had practiced corporate law for 30 years before Julian recruited him to run Vance Global's legal division. He was meticulous, cautious, and deeply uncomfortable with surprises. The past week had tested every one of those qualities. "Walk me through where we stand," Julian said. Robert opened a thick binder on the table. "Arthur Pendleton has been formally suspended since the board meeting. His attorney contacted us yesterday, requesting a negotiated separation. They want a quiet exit with a standard severance package and a mutual non-disclosure agreement." "Absolutely not. I told them you'd say that." Robert turned to the next section of the binder. "Based on the evidence compiled by Dr. Mercer and your forensic accounting team, we have sufficient grounds to pursue termination for cause on multiple counts: breach of fiduciary duty, falsification of corporate records, fraudulent insurance claims, and unauthorized diversion of company assets. Each of those counts independently justifies termination without severance under his employment contract. What about criminal referral? That's where it gets more involved. The insurance fraud alone crosses the threshold for grand larceny under Massachusetts state law. 47 fraudulent damage reports resulting in nearly $1.8 million in false insurance payouts. The diversion of goods to Northline Freight adds a commercial fraud dimension. If we refer the matter to the district attorney's office, Arthur is looking at multiple felony charges." Julian leaned forward. "Who else was involved?" Robert flipped to a personnel summary. "Your forensic team identified 2 accomplices within the Boston Hub's management structure: Frank Delaney, the night shift operations supervisor, and Catherine Wells, the administrative coordinator responsible for processing the damage reports. Delaney handled the physical application of the enzyme compound during the night shift. Wells processed the falsified paperwork and coordinated the diversion logistics with the intermediary brokers connected to Northline Freight. How long were all 3 of them running this?" "Based on the financial records, the scheme began approximately 14 months ago. Delaney was recruited by Arthur about 2 months before the first fraudulent damage report was filed. Wells came on board shortly after. The operation was small by design. 3 people, minimal documentation, and a biological sabotage method that nobody in the company was equipped to detect." Julian sat with that for a moment. 3 people, 14 months, $1.8 million in insurance fraud, plus the resale profits from the diverted cargo. Arthur had built a tight, efficient little operation inside the walls of Julian's own company, and if Chloe Mercer hadn't noticed a faint green discoloration on a piece of cedar wood during a Tuesday evening dinner, it might have continued for years. "Terminate all 3 today," Julian said. "For cause, no severance, no negotiation. Revoke their access to all company systems, recover any company property in their possession, and have security escort them from any company premises they're currently on. Then file the criminal referral with the district attorney's office. Full cooperation, full disclosure, all evidence made available." Robert made notes in his binder. "Arthur's attorney will fight the termination. They'll argue that the evidence was gathered through irregular channels, that Dr. Mercer wasn't properly credentialed at the time of the initial testing, and that the warehouse inspection was conducted without following standard internal audit procedures. Every sample was collected under my direct authorization as owner and CEO. The chain of custody is documented and co-signed by both me and Dr. Mercer. The compliance director processed Chloe's consultant designation before any evidence was presented to the board. Arthur's own compliance complaint is on file, which actually strengthens our position because it proves he was aware of the investigation and took active steps to obstruct it. Robert allowed himself a thin smile. That complaint was a gift, frankly. His attorney is going to wish Arthur had never filed it. What about Northline Freight? Separate matter. Our legal team is preparing a civil action for recovery of the diverted goods, or their equivalent market value. We're also notifying the insurance carrier about the fraudulent claims, so they can pursue their own recovery against Arthur and his accomplices. The carrier will want to cooperate with us on this, since they're out nearly $2 million themselves. Julian stood and walked to the window. The harbor was busy this morning. Container ships moving through the channel. Tugboats guiding a bulk carrier toward the commercial docks across the water. His company moved cargo on those same waterways every day. Thousands of shipments, millions of dollars in goods, all flowing through a system that he had built from nothing, and that someone he trusted had been hollowing out from the inside. One more thing, Julian said, turning back to Robert. I want the board to approve a complete overhaul of the Quality Assurance Division, new protocols, new equipment, new reporting structure. Dr. Mercer has drafted a detection and prevention framework that covers biological, chemical, and environmental contamination screening. I want it adopted company-wide as the new standard. Robert raised an eyebrow. You want an external botanist to redesign your QA infrastructure? I want the person who found the problem in 48 hours, that my entire organization missed for 14 months, to tell us how to make sure it never happens again. Draft the proposal for board approval. I want it on the agenda for the next regular session. I'll have it ready by end of week. Julian gathered his files and headed for the door. Send the termination letters to Arthur, Delaney, and Wells by noon. And Robert, make sure Arthur's attorney understands something clearly. There will be no quiet exit. There will be no non-disclosure agreement. What Arthur did to this company is going to be fully documented, fully prosecuted, and fully on the record. If his lawyer has a problem with that, he can take it up with the district attorney. Robert closed his binder and nodded. Understood. Julian walked back to his office and closed the door. He sat down at his desk and looked at the framed photograph on the credenza behind his chair. It showed a 26-year-old version of himself standing in front of a rented warehouse in Revere, Massachusetts, the day he signed his first commercial lease. One truck, one warehouse, one contract with a local furniture manufacturer. That was the foundation of everything. 20 years later, the company had grown beyond anything that young man could have imagined. And it had taken a woman in a canvas apron, testing soil in a glass house he didn't even know existed, to show him where the cracks were forming in the thing he had built. He picked up his phone and called Daniel, booked 2 seats on tomorrow's afternoon flight to Portland, then arrange a car to the main estate. I need to have a conversation with Dr. Mercer. The flight to Portland took 50 minutes. Julian spent most of it staring out the window at the coastline below, watching the jagged Maine shoreline emerge from the afternoon haze like a rough pencil sketch being slowly filled in with color. He had made this trip 3 times in the past week, and each time the landscape looked different to him. The first time, he had seen acreage, infrastructure, and commercial potential. Now he saw something else, though he wasn't quite ready to put a name to it. Marcus picked them up at the airport and drove north along the coastal highway toward the estate. Daniel sat in the back seat, reviewing documents on his tablet. Julian had asked him to prepare a specific contract, and Daniel had spent the previous evening working with Robert Ames to draft the language. The document was now stored on Daniel's tablet, waiting for Julian's final review. They arrived at the estate a little before 4 in the afternoon. The weather had shifted from the fog and gray of the previous days to something unexpectedly warm and clear. Late afternoon sunlight poured across the grounds, turning the ocean a deep, almost impossible blue. The glass house caught the light and threw it back in fractured patterns across the courtyard. Even the old colonial main house looked less like a relic and more like something worth preserving. Julian told Marcus and Daniel to wait at the main house. He walked across the courtyard alone, past the glass house, and down the sloping lawn toward the waterfront. The gravel path gave way to a wooden boardwalk that led to the deep-water dock. The dock had been cleaned up during the week. Julian had arranged for a local marine contractor to inspect the pilings, replace the rotted decking boards, and install new cleats and bumpers along the berth face. The work was cosmetic for now, a first step toward making the structure operational for commercial use. But standing on the fresh planking with the Atlantic stretching out before him, Julian could already see what this place could become. He heard footsteps on the boardwalk behind him and turned. Chloe was walking toward the dock, wearing her usual canvas apron over a green sweater, her hair loose for once and catching the salt breeze. She had dirt on her hands and a pair of gardening gloves tucked into her apron pocket. She had been working in the glass house, obviously, doing the thing she had been doing long before Julian Vance ever signed a purchase agreement for this property. "Daniel told me you wanted to talk," she said, stepping onto the dock. "He was supposed to tell you to meet me here at 4:30. You're early." "I was repotting a batch of seedlings that couldn't wait until 4:30, so I figured I'd come now and let them settle." Julian almost laughed. A week ago, that kind of response would have irritated him. A person prioritizing plant schedules over a meeting with the CEO of a billion-dollar logistics company. Now it struck him as one of the most reasonable things anyone had said to him in years. Chloe operated on her own calendar, dictated by growth cycles and soil chemistry and the particular needs of living things that didn't care about corporate hierarchies. There was an honesty in that which Julian had encountered very rarely in his professional life. "I want to offer you a position," Julian said. Chloe leaned against the dock railing and looked at him with the same steady, unhurried expression she had given him the first morning in the glass house when he told her he owned the property. "What kind of position?" "Chief Officer of Cargo Integrity and Enterprise Botanical Safety." Chloe blinked. "That's quite a title. Robert Ames spent 2 hours on it. I think he enjoyed himself." Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to Chloe. "The role would report directly to me. You'd oversee the company's entire quality assurance infrastructure, with specific authority over biological and chemical contamination prevention across all 6 regional hubs. The position comes with a full corporate salary, benefits, and an operational budget sufficient to staff a dedicated team under your supervision." Chloe unfolded the document and began reading. Julian watched her eyes move across the pages, the same careful, methodical attention she gave to every piece of data that passed through her hands. "There's a second component," Julian said. "Page 4. Chloe turned to the 4th page and read in silence for a long moment. Then she looked up. "A research facility. Fully funded. State-of-the-art equipment. Dedicated lab space. Procurement budget for reagents and materials. Built inside the Glasshouse Conservatory, designed around your existing workspace, so you don't have to relocate your current research. You keep your university affiliation, you keep your grant work, and you gain access to resources that no academic institution in New England could match." Chloe looked down at the contract again, then out at the water. A pair of lobster boats were motoring past the rock formation to the north, their wakes leaving white trails on the blue surface. The afternoon light was shifting toward gold as the sun dropped lower over the mainland behind them. "Mr. Vance, a week ago you told me to pack up my things and leave this glass house within 7 days. I did. And now you're offering to build me a laboratory inside it." "I am." Chloe folded the contract and held it against the dock railing. The breeze ruffled the edges of the pages. "Why?" Julian considered the question carefully. He could have given her a business answer. return on investment, risk mitigation, competitive advantage. All of those things were true, and all of them were in the contract language that Robert Ames had drafted. But standing on this dock, looking at a woman who had spent 11 years quietly doing important work in a glasshouse that nobody else in the world was paying attention to, Julian felt that a business answer would be insufficient. Because I have spent 20 years building a company based on the idea that I could control every variable through systems, protocols, and the right personnel in the right positions. And in one dinner conversation, you showed me a threat that my entire organization was blind to. You did it with a UV lamp, a set of reagents you bought from university surplus sales, and a notebook you've been writing in since before I knew this property existed. He paused and looked out at the harbor. I don't need another executive who tells me what I want to hear. I need someone who sees what I'm missing. You do that naturally. It's how your mind works. And I'd rather have you inside my organization applying that mind to my problems than out here alone, where the next person who buys this property might not have the sense to listen to you. Chloe was quiet for a while. The lobster boats had rounded the point and disappeared. The water was settling into long, smooth swells that rocked gently against the dock pilings. I have conditions, she said. Name them. My research remains independent. I publish my findings through academic channels without corporate review or approval. The glass house stays a working botanical facility, not a showroom. And I choose my own team. Done. Chloe looked at the contract one more time. Then she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a pen, and signed the last page against the dock railing. She handed the document back to Julian. I'll need the lab renovation plans by the end of the month, she said. And I want Rachel from the New York hub on my team. She's wasted in a regional inspection role. Julian took the signed contract and tucked it into his jacket. I'll have Daniel start the transfer paperwork tomorrow. They stood together on the dock as the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the fresh planking. The estate spread out behind them, the glass house glinting in the late light, the old main house solid and patient on the hill above. Somewhere inside that glass house, a batch of seedlings was settling into new pots, beginning the slow, invisible work of putting down roots. Julian Vance had come to this property for a deep water dock. He had found something far more valuable, and it had been standing in his way the entire time, covered in potting soil, holding a contract he couldn't break. He looked at Chloe Mercer, his new chief officer of cargo integrity, who was already pulling her gardening gloves back on and heading up the boardwalk toward the glass house. Dr. Mercer, he called after her. She turned. Welcome to Vance Global. Chloe gave him a small nod, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her all week, and disappeared into the golden light of the conservatory. Julian stayed on the dock a while longer, watching the Atlantic roll in, steady and patient, the way it had for 1,000 years before he arrived, and would for 1,000 years after. Then he turned and walked up the hill to begin building something new,